Election season only began a week ago, and manifestos still haven't been published, but that doesn't mean that the political parties haven't started bringing out the daggers already. In the last few days, politicians have begun to make major claims about their opposition parties, and their plans for the future of Britain. No argument seemed to capture more attention than the Conservatives' claims that Labour would spend an additional £1.2 trillion if they were elected. To put that in perspective, over the course of a 5-year parliament, the UK ordinarily spends about £4 trillion, so that means if Labour's pledges do add up to £1.2 trillion, that's certainly a lot more money. So, if the Conservatives are claiming that Labour will be adding 13 digits of additional spending, we wanted to dive into that claim. Before we do, a quick shout out to our merch store. We have a whole bunch of Countries with Shoes pins available now, and a number have low stock levels, so pick them up if you're interested. Your support makes these videos possible, and we really appreciate it. So, as I said in the introduction, the manifestos haven't been released, and likely won't be until next week at the earliest. So without a manifesto, it must have been challenging for the Conservatives to work out how much Labour wanted to spend, right? Well, kind of. It's always virtually impossible for parties to price their opposition's policies, so it's common to see both sides throwing around estimated figures. So while the Conservatives are the ones doing the very, very shaky maths this time round, Labour aren't exactly innocent of this. That being said, the £1.2 trillion calculation is certainly pretty rough. The Conservatives published a 36-page document explaining their calculation. They say they came up with this number by estimating the total spending plans from Labour's 2017 manifesto. And according to them, the 2017 Labour pledges total to £600 billion worth of spending. They assume that these pledges will still stand in the yet-to-be-announced 2019 manifesto, so this is where the maths begins. They then add up all of the promises that Labour have made since then, including the policies discussed at the Labour Party conference. The Conservatives estimate that these policies also add up to another £600 billion. So then the maths is simple. 600 billion plus 600 billion takes the total to the £1.2 trillion that the Tories are accusing. Now, as we said, these kind of estimates are common across both parties in elections. Pretty much every election cycle, the Conservatives accuse Labour of overspending, so no one's really surprised that they're taking this approach. That being said, the figure itself might come as a bit of a shock. However, the number is very likely inaccurate. Firstly, there's a huge number of assumptions baked into this calculation. At this stage, we couldn't possibly tell what percentage of the 2017 manifesto will make it into the 2019 one, and we also don't know which of the policies discussed since then will actually be introduced. Secondly, it makes an assumption about how the policies will be implemented. For example, even when it comes to policies that we know Labour stands by, like renationalisation, the assumptions look deliberately unfavourable to Labour. The Conservatives say that renationalisation will cost £196 billion, but that's based on the assumption that a Labour government would pay 30% more than the current market value to buy back those industries, and also fails to account for any of the revenue that give the government post-nationalisation. So while there's no doubt that Labour are making some big spending promises, this £1.2 trillion figure likely isn't very accurate. Regardless, the Conservatives appear to see it as a point they can hammer the Labour Party with, going on to claim in more recent days that citizens would need to be taxed to cover this expenditure. In fact, just yesterday, the Conservatives tweeted out a video claiming that under Labour, taxpayers would have to pay, on average, £2,400 more tax every year. Chancellor Sajid Javid retweeted this, adding, "A vote for Corbyn's Labour is a vote for higher taxes and chaos of 2 more referendums." It certainly seems plausible that if Labour did increase public spending so significantly, an increase in taxation would be necessary, and that's not something Labour have shied away from. Regardless though, the £2,400 a year figure is likely more misleading than the £1.2 trillion. The Conservatives published a 15-page document to back up the 2400 tax figure. But the major problem is again with the assumptions. Like the £1.2 trillion figure, it makes major assumptions about Labour's policies before a manifesto has even been released. In fact, those assumptions have been compounded, because the £2,400 a year in extra tax is calculated using the £1.2 trillion total as a starting point. Going back to that initial tweet, the key part of the statement is average. Under their assumptions, this might be the average taxation increase that the Conservatives found, but according to Labour, it's not representative of reality. That's because Labour say that taxes will only be increased for the highest 5% of earners, and not the whole population, meaning the average is kind of meaningless. Labour even have a calculator where you can find out how much you pay under their plans. In the description, we'll add a link to the Labour tax calculator, as well as both Conservative documents, which explain the 1.2 trillion and 2.4 thousand calculations. If you enjoyed this video, let us know by dropping it a like. As we acknowledged, it's definitely not just the Conservatives making questionable claims, so if you'd like us to cover other election claims, then let us know which ones you'd like to see investigated in the comments below. If you want to see more coverage from the UK's upcoming general election, be sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video, and you can find more from us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And finally, if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.